my name's Penny, and today I wanted to talk about the books that I read in the first half of the month, even though it's now quite a bit after that, but it's still the middle of the month, so we're going to talk about them because I already have 10 books. It's way too many, so let's talk about them. I am going to divide this into, I think, 4 sections. First I'll talk about the physical books I read, then the graphics, and the audiobooks, and then lastly a couple of non-fiction. So firstly, physical books, and I don't have this one here because I've already returned it to the library, and that is Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. So this is the 7th book in the Throne of Glass series, and as the 7th book, it wasn't really a surprise that I didn't really like it. Now, I did quite like the first book, which is about this assassin called Selena, who is winning her freedom by winning this competition and becoming the king's champion. But then it turned out that she was more than that. The world grew. There was the introduction of Fae and these dark powers and a whole bunch of other characters. And for the most part, I've never really cared about them. Also, this last book was primarily about romance and war, and I don't particularly like romance or war. It wasn't a particular surprise that I didn't like it. I also thought it was just way longer than it needed to be. There were so many different perspectives going on, and for the first half of the book, it kept doing this thing where you would come back to a particular group of characters and something had just happened to them, and you'd be told what happened to them, and then everyone would explain their feelings about that thing. And I really just wanted to be there when the action was happening. So I found the first half of the book quite frustrating. Second half of the book did get a lot better. There was a lot more action, but as I said, it was mostly war, and I don't particularly like reading about war. I just find it quite detailed and boring. Also, in terms of the romance, there's only one couple that I particularly ship, and they were fighting for most of the book. And another character that I kind of like, her romance was also a mess for the first half of the book. So the first half of the book, I honestly think, could have just been deleted because it was way too long. Also, I don't think there was enough death. I really think, in the end, that my favorite character should have died. Which is not generally how you finish up a book. But really, hardly anyone died when you consider how many different characters there were, and that this was supposed to be this epic battle where they were all at risk. Very few characters died. And once I got the feeling that no one was going to die, just didn't feel that worried or emotionally invested. I probably didn't from the beginning. But I know some people really love this book and the series, so really, I just need to stop buying into the hype and reading books that are primarily romance when I know that I don't like romance. But as I said, I did really like the first book. Okay, then I read Slayer by Kiersten White. So this is a book set in the Buffy the Vampire Slayer world, and it's official canon. Now, I do think what some people don't realize is that after the 7th series of the TV show, the Buffy story continued in comic book series, and there are season 8, 9, 10, 11, and they've just started season 12 in comic book series. This one I think is set after season 9 or 10, I forget which ones. But I do think if you haven't read the comic book series and you're interested in reading it, you probably should read it before you read this, because this does contain some small spoilers, and really, it's just better to read things in chronological order if you're planning on reading them. That said, if you don't want to read the comic book series because you're not interested in like graphic reads, then it won't really matter, but you might find it a little bit of a changed world between the TV show and this book, because things are very different with the Slayers and with magic. So this book, we follow this girl named Nina, who is part of the Watcher Academy along with her twin sister. The Watchers being the people who like train and teach and protect the vampire slayers. So it's not really a surprise, given the name of the book, that Nina then actually ends up becoming a slayer. So she's both kind of a watcher and kind of a slayer. I actually really enjoyed this book. It was sort of targeted at a younger demographic, which is almost going back to Buffy's origins, because initially the TV show was a lot more targeted at teens or younger teens, of which I am definitely not. but I didn't think the fact that she was quite a young character made her too annoying, like sometimes it happens. And once I picked this up, I didn't really want to put it down because there were just so many different mysteries in play, like around her family and what was going on with the Watchers at this point, and also some demons hanging around. So everything that was happening, you were always learning a little bit more about these different mysteries. I also think that Kiersten White did a really good job of duplicating the humor from the TV show in this book, which made it quite fun to read. So if you're at all interested in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I do recommend this. Also, since we're talking about Slayer stuff, I also realized that there were 2 more graphic novel comic bind-up things available at my library that I hadn't read. Let's talk about the crap one first, which is Giles Girl Blue. So, slight spoilers, but at some point Giles ends up dead and then he gets... Spoilers, be prepared. If you don't want them, skip. But at some point he gets brought back to life as a child and he is now growing up again. So at this point he's some kind of teen. He ends up hooking up with this girl. To be honest, the whole story didn't really make sense. There was this demon guy, and when he was talking I was constantly like, what are you even saying? Although I did quite like the relationship he had with Giles. He kept calling Giles his mother because apparently Giles created him, although I still don't really understand that. And there was just so much talking and dialogue that I didn't understand. Also, there's this romance going on and there's no chemistry, there's no justification for it. The title is Girl Blue and there's this character called Blue, and who is she? Why is she relevant? No idea. So this was not really very good, which was quite disappointing because I like Giles. Never mind. I also read The Reckoning, which is an actual Buffy story. This one has a bit of time travel, which I really liked. Some of the artwork was good, like these cover pages that they put in for the different comics. I do remember, I think the last volume of these comic books that I read, I thought the art had really gone downhill. But this wasn't too bad. I mean, at least most of the characters looked like real people and looked like who they were most of the time. Although I really wasn't happy with what's happening with Buffy's dating situation in this. I was quite happy with who she was with, but apparently in this book she's not. So that's annoying. But it was just a big epic battle with some time travel mixed in. Not really amazing like some of the different storylines have been, but it was a good little story. It involved a lot of the different characters. That was cool, and I enjoyed it. Okay, so we've transitioned into graphic novels at this point. So the next book that I read is Return to Labyrinth by some people. Jake Forbes and Chris Lai did the artwork, although the cover art is by a completely different person, which is unfortunate because this cover is beautiful. And this is based on the Labyrinth movie, which is an amazing movie. We have David Bowie as the Goblin King, and in the movie he steals this girl's baby brother, and she has to travel through the labyrinth to get her baby brother back. This Return to Labyrinth follows the baby brother, who now has been living in such a way that whenever he makes a wish, the Goblin King will grant it, and it's not always going well. So now he's like, I'm going to do everything myself, but he's such a whiny little brat. He struggles with that. His homework gets stolen, and so he chases it into the labyrinth. And the fact that the main conflict was that this whiny little brat can't deal with his life and he has to chase his homework into the labyrinth was a bit disappointing. There was a lot of the old characters from the movie included in this, but they didn't really feel like they were included for a purpose. It was more like just including them for nostalgia because people were going to like that. And then there were some really interesting side characters. Some of them are included in this final picture. So this girl here and her sister over here were quite interesting. And this goblin, maybe a goblin, girl here, quite interesting, but not included enough, or not enough happened. I don't know, this is a 4-book series, and I looked it up and my library does have the other 3, so I'll probably get it to see if more happens, because now Toby is in the Goblin City and hopefully something interesting is going to happen rather than like whiny schoolboy shit. So then I also read 3 audiobooks. The first one that I read is The Blind Assassin, and no, I don't think this is an audiobook. I listened to the audiobook, but the reason why I have this is this was on my physical TBR, and so now I can tick this off without actually having read the physical form. But I'm glad, because I know that there is no way I could have gotten through this in physical. It was just, Margaret Atwood's writing style is not for me. It's very theme focused and very atmospheric, but there's not a lot of actual stuff happening. And this story was just weird. There's like so many stories within the story. To some degree, we're following this old woman, and she is talking about, you know, how hard her life is now and how much things have changed. And then she's also telling us the story of when her sister was found after a car crash, and also the story of them kind of growing up from when they were kids. But also, all of this is interspersed with these snippets of a story that was published by her sister, which is kind of this fantastical story called The Blind Assassin. But even that story is told in such a way that it's this couple talking, and the man keeps telling her parts of the story, but even that story is then making quite a lot of commentary about society, and that story is just weird. So it was all really strange. I listened to it really quick though. I think I listened to it in like a day, mostly while I was mowing my lawns. I will say in the end it did all kind of come together, and I felt like it had a really strong point, but it was a slog to get there, and I think at this point I'm just going to give up with Margaret Atwood. Luckily, nothing else on my shelves by her. So that's done. Then I had no other audiobooks because everything else that I'd picked was on hold, so I had a look at what was available, and I came up with Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, which I wasn't sure how I'd feel about it, but I actually really ended up liking it. Even though it is quite slow, it does to some degree have Name of the Wind vibes. We've got this old man who's telling his story, and you can't really be sure if he's being completely honest. He does seem very perfect, so that does make you doubt his honesty. But he's telling his story. He is the bastard son of the king in waiting, and it follows him from when he's 6. I did really like the revelation about his magical abilities. So he can basically bond and speak to animals mind to mind. But obviously when it's telling the story from a 6-year-old perspective, it just includes aspects of talking to animals without really explaining it, because obviously a 6-year-old who can do this would just think that's the way it is, and that's the way the narrative is told, which I really enjoyed. I do have to say, trigger warning for this book, the dogs die, which was not my favorite part of the book. But for the most part, he is becoming an assassin's apprentice, as the title is called. He's learning how to navigate court life to some degree, getting involved in politics. They're also being raided by these Red Raiders, who are then forging people, which was pretty awful, and he ends up having to go and fight these forged people. I won't explain what they are, but they're kind of awful. And just in general, it kind of meanders along. It's quite slow, but by the end you find you really are attached to the character, and some of the things that happen are quite exciting. I will say I really recommend this as audiobook. I do think because it's so slow that, again, I would have struggled to get through it in physical form, but the audiobook was really good. The acting was really good. I think he does really great voices. It's just a really quality audiobook. And I'm currently listening to the second book in the series, and I think I will try to finish the whole thing this month. So if you check out my end of the month wrap up whenever I get around to putting that up, you'll be able to see what I think of the whole series. Although I believe it's part of kind of a series of series, all set in the same world. but we'll get through it. Then the last audiobook I read in the first half of the month was The Mermaid by Christina Henry. So this is a story about a mermaid who gets caught by a fisherman, ends up falling in love with him and living with him. That part of the story was all told very slowly, and the narrative seemed quite separate from the characters. Like, it treated the characters as objects, because for the most part they were just referred to as the mermaid and the fisherman, and they didn't really feel like real people, even though it was kind of an interesting story. It was told very fairy tale-ish. It didn't feel very real. And that bit went on for quite some time before we eventually got to the main point of the book, which is that the mermaid ends up becoming part of P.T. Barnum's museum and shows. This part was much more enjoyable, although it really didn't paint P.T. Barnum in a good light, because the mermaid is always having to fight with him to get kind of her rights. He kind of treats her as just a piece of the exhibit, like an animal to be displayed, and she's trying to say, no, I'm actually a person and I deserve certain things. And most of the story is about that conflict. There's also a lot of stuff about her not really understanding the different human customs, like modesty around your body. She just doesn't understand that. I really liked how she has difficulty conversing with humans because she just doesn't find communication in that way natural. So in the end, turned out to be an okay story, but the beginning was slow, so overall it was just kind of average. Then briefly, just to talk about two non-fiction books that I read. I did read this Scrum pocket guide. I have put a few thingies in here, so there were some interesting points, but I was looking at this to see if this would be something useful just to like suggest to people to read, to learn about Scrum. And it suggests it's a pocket guide, so that's like something you could just be like, oh, quickly, I'll look up that thing. But it's not really useful for that. I do think it describes some of the concepts really well, but it's not what I was hoping it would be. So that's a shame. I did also read Designing Your Life by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. So this was an audiobook I listened to, and I really like this. It talks about applying design thinking and prototyping to how you create your life and how you find what you might like your life to be like. And it was interesting because as I read it, I realized that that is a lot of how I have designed my life, although it did include some interesting activities which really helped me to think about what I might do next, since at the moment I'm having a year off and what I might do next is a little bit up in the air. But maybe I will prototype some things soon and I'll work out what I'm doing next. So I found it really interesting. I do think if you are at any point where you're not sure what you want to do next, or maybe you think you have found what you want to do next but it isn't seeming to make you happy, that this might be a really interesting book to read, just to help you figure out what you might do next. So I do think if I had to pick a favourite of all the books I've read this month so far, it would be Assassin's Apprentice. Can't really say why, I just really had a much more emotional attachment to that story than any of the other stories that I read. So if you were going to pick up one book from this video, then that would be the one I suggest. I do think that I need to start doing like weekly wrap-ups or something, because I'm reading way too much at the moment and that was way too many books to talk about. But we will see what happens. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.